The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. We have to do the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and smeared the clay on his eyes, and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed, and came back able to see. His neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is," but others said, "No, he just looks like him." He said, "I am." So they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" He replied, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went there and washed and was able to see." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." They brought the one who was once blind to the Pharisees. Now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on a Sabbath. So then the Pharisees also asked him how he was able to see. He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." So some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a sinful man do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you have to say about him, since he opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." Now the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and gained his sight until they summoned the parents of the one who had gained his sight. They asked them, "Is this your son whom you say was born blind? How does he now see?" His parents answered and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. We do not know how he sees now, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged him as the Christ, he would be expelled from the synagogue. For this reason his parents said, "He is of age. Question him." So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner." He replied, "If he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know is that I was blind, and now I see." So they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" They ridiculed him and said, "You are that man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where this one is from." The man answered and said to them, "That is what is so amazing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if one is devout and does his will, he listens to him. It is unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything." They answered and said to him, "You were born totally in sin, and are you trying to teach us?" Then they threw him out. When Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, he found him and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered and said, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "I do believe, Lord," and he worshiped him. Then Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who do see might become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not also blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you are saying, 'We see,' so your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I want to invite all of us today to take a moment and place ourselves at that pool of Siloam. If we look back in the history of Israel, we realize that that place, that location, is central to the way that the Lord works through the ups and downs of Israel's history. We start our story with David. We got the beginning of his story in today's first reading. He's a shepherd. He's out taking care of the sheep, and then is called in to be anointed the next king of Israel. It catapults him into a totally different track of life. Little did he expect anything of that sort to come down the pike, and yet that leads him into that battle with Goliath. It leads him into being in the court of Saul, accepted by Saul as one he loved and then rejected completely. Ran out, chased around the countryside. This is when he writes some of the psalms that we love so much. "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want." Here is David, a shepherd, catapulted into this scenario of the court and the king and intrigue and all of that, yet he's remaining faithful to the Lord. Saul and his son Jonathan eventually are killed, and David begins to collect the tribes around himself as the king. But he needs a central location, a capital city around which all the tribes can unite, not one of their own towns. And so it is that he comes up to Jerusalem with the army that he's collected, meaning to conquer it as the capital of Israel. It's a stronghold on a mountain. It's a perfect city. It's a perfect capital. The Canaanites, though, have it already taken. So David needs a way to get into this city. And Joab, one of his officers, courageously, ingeniously decides to crawl up the water source of the city. There's this spring of Gihon on the side of the city. Another reason why it's this perfect place. He crawls up through the way that stream trickles down and then up into the channels of water out under the city. He breaks up into the city, runs down to the gate, opens the doors, the troops flood in, Jerusalem is theirs. That place where the water trickled out, that water eventually would become the pool of Siloam years later. But it's also as that water trickles down from the city of Jerusalem, down into the Kidron Valley, that decades later in David's own life, he will see his fortunes completely turned. That place that was a place of victory, a place of defeating the enemy, a place of conquering the city, a place of bringing the tribes together in a place where they can centrally worship the Lord. Now that place becomes a place of shame and disgrace. His own son, Absalom, rises up against David, and David has to flee the city of Jerusalem. As he's going out, he goes down through that Kidron Valley, past that stream coming from the spring of Gihon, and up the Mount of Olives. As he flees, this is his prayer. "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back, and let me see both it," that is the Ark of the Covenant, "and his habitation. But if he says, 'I have no pleasure in you,' behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." In the midst of affliction, David is faithful, and the Lord will bring him back from that exile, back to Jerusalem, back to his city. Let's stay at that spring for a minute more. Fast forward a couple hundred years. David's descendant, Hezekiah, sits on the throne. He faces a very different situation. They've had many, many bad kings. Hezekiah is a good one. He tries to bring the people back to the Lord, But now Assyria sits at the gates. Sennacherib, the great king of Assyria, has conquered city after city after city in the surrounding territory, demolishing them, destroying them, wiping them out. Now he's heading towards Jerusalem. Hezekiah has a choice to make. So many of those other kings have turned to other countries, to other cities, to other powers. Egypt, come to our aid. Someone come help us. Allying with pagan rulers around that area. He chooses to not do that. He chooses to stay with the Lord. He chooses to take care of his people as best he can. For that reason, he very practically and very marvelously decides to close off that way that David had first broken into Jerusalem. He shuts down some of those openings, those culverts of water from the spring of Gihon. He carves a new tunnel, this one down under the city of Jerusalem. It's 1/3 of a mile long. It's still there today. You can walk through it. It's like shoulder width wide, like 3 or 4 feet tall. There's water that trickles down it. But it's a marvel of engineering because they carved from both ends and met in the middle perfectly. This is without sonar and equipment and stuff. It's 1/3 of a mile long, and it drops 1 foot over that entire distance so that the water will still flow. It moves back and forth, and it somehow links up in the middle. It's marvelous. And yet Hezekiah sees that as a blessing of the Lord, as a providential caring of God. And when Assyria's army stands at the gates and shouts up and curses the God of Israel and says, all these other gods, they were worthless, their cities are destroyed. How about yours? He's not going to do anything. We have hundreds of thousands of men ready to level your city. Hezekiah goes into the temple. He drops down on his knees before the Lord, and this is his prayer. O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone, therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us, I beg you, from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. Hezekiah's prayer is heard. Assyria's army is mysteriously, miraculously destroyed. Was it by pestilence or an angel or some other reason? We don't know. But he's camped out in front of the gates, and many, many, many of his men perish. For whatever reason, he turns back around and leaves, and Jerusalem is saved. But let's fast forward another several hundred years and bring ourselves to the point where Jesus Christ is entering Jerusalem. He's just been rejected by the Galileans, where he preached in Capernaum the great bread of life discourse, and many, many turn away. Discouraged, disheartened, certainly. His close comrades, his family relations say, hey, go down to Jerusalem. The Feast of Booths is happening. You can make a great entrance. You can get many people following you. He says no. He chooses to go down secretly, not making a scene. He comes through over the Mount of Olives and into the city of Jerusalem. He walks up the great central street that goes from that pool of Siloam, where that tunnel of Hezekiah ended, and he goes all the way up to the temple of Jerusalem, gleaming at the top of the city. The Feast of Tabernacles is happening, the Feast of Booths, where they would take a giant container of water, a golden container. They would carry it from the pool of Siloam up this street with rejoicing and singing and torches and procession. They would bring it into the temple, where they had giant menorahs lit with flames on them. This huge ceremony of fire and water. Why? Because the Feast of Booths is commemorating that time in the wilderness, that time of the Exodus, when God led his people out, splitting the water, right? Leading them through with the pillar of fire and then bringing forth water from the rock to sustain his people in the desert, in the wilderness. The Feast of Booths was meant to bring them back to that place when they lived in tents, and when God dwelt with them in a tent as well. And Jesus Christ marches up into the temple, into the great courtyard, and he proclaims to everyone that has collected there, I am the light of the world. I am the living waters. More than that, right? He's claiming to be the source of that fire and that water that had sustained the Israelites in Egypt and that they celebrate that day. But he goes farther. He says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, Golgotha is right up over the temple. When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. And I do nothing on my own authority, but speak thus as the Father taught me. He's claiming identity with God. He's claiming to know the Father personally, to proclaim him to everyone there. And they run him out of the temple. They try to kill him. He marches back down that giant road. He comes past, close to the pool of Siloam. How disheartened, how discouraged he must have felt. They had rejected him. Another group had rejected him. Yet then he sees that man born blind, and he stops. Because Jesus Christ is not done yet. He's not done proclaiming who he is. He's not just the way that the Israelites were provided for in the temple. No, he is the God of creation. He is the Son of the Father who created the world, whose Spirit went over the face of the deep, who brought the light out of heaven, who made the stars and the cosmos and creation, who split the water and the land. This is the true God of fire, of light, and of water. And he means to bring that power to bear on this man, blind, in the dark, unable to work, unable to have a family, unable to take care of himself. The man doesn't even speak during the first half of the parable, not until his eyes are opened. And Jesus, God, touches the earth again. He spits into it, and he brings life into the clay. And he puts it on the man's eyes, and he brings sight to his blindness. The man's eyes are opened as he washes in the water of Siloam. That place where so many times, during the ups and downs of Israel, during the victory and the defeat that David had seen, he remained faithful to the Lord there, in that spot. When Hezekiah was faced with the greatest of marvelous ingenuity, right, and the greatest of fears, of just immense dismay at the possibility of him and all his people, the entire city being destroyed. Again, what does he do? He turns to the Lord and gives him glory. And then Jesus Christ, in the midst of being rejected by all, being ran out of town, being ignored, reviled, despised, persecuted, he chooses that place to show who he is, yes, but to show how much he wants that power of God to be manifested in the love that he brings to bear on that one man that sits there alone and in the dark. My brothers and sisters, these days, I suspect, are very similar for us. We look at the world around us, and in many ways, we don't know where it's going, right? Perhaps we're like David, and we feel ran out of town, like this whole thing has fallen apart, like we've been catapulted into a world and a life and a situation that we didn't want to be in. We didn't want this responsibility, much less the pressure and stress that's upon us. Perhaps like Hezekiah, we feel like the army is at the gates, the enemy is there. Like we can't take care of our family, we can't protect our home, we can't keep things intact the way they've been. What can we do? Perhaps we feel like the blind man who sits there. Maybe we're unable to work during these days. Maybe we're unable to see the future, to know what's coming. Maybe we look and we see how the world has rejected Christ in many ways, has ignored him, forgotten him. In the midst of chaos and difficulty and challenges, we haven't turned to God, we've turned to our own ingenuity. We haven't given him glory, we haven't trusted him. We've tried to do things for ourselves. Okay? But how about us? How about me? How about myself, my home, my household, my family? We can choose to serve, we can choose to trust, we can choose to still worship, we can choose to still give glory to God. My brothers and sisters, this week, this day, yes, perhaps we're sitting next to that pool, but Jesus Christ means to touch us too, to recreate us too, to show his power in our lives too, to bring us through this and everything too. Let's make our prayer that of the man born blind. Jesus asks us, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you trust him with your entire life, with everything? The man born blind, hopefully us as well, can answer, who is he, sir, that I may believe in? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him.